We are back, and we are joined now by Ronnie Chatah, writer, host of the Beirut Banyan, and founder of Walk Beirut. Ronnie, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
It's an honor.
So,
And I'd like to say I'd never imagined being associated with O.J. Simpson in any geopolitical context. So that makes the occasion a bit stranger.
yes. I mean, we have to acknowledge that he died, but I don't really know what other commentary I have about it except
maybe we'll focus a little bit on Nicole Brown a little bit later.
Yes.
But yeah,
but you know, the reference to Kurt Cobain is actually timely as well. They're roughly around the same period, the early 90s. For political purposes, this is around the time Arab-Israeli peace becomes political discourse as well. So perhaps it does tie into the story.
It does. Thank you for making me more thematically consistent than my actual commentary engenders. But I really appreciate you coming on, Ronnie. I'll start here. What has life in Lebanon been like since October 7th? Israel has been striking southern Lebanon basically since shortly after Hamas's attack. I guess, what's it been like, and how does it feel to kind of be in such close proximity to all this violence?
For better or worse, in Lebanon, this is familiar territory. This isn't the first time Lebanon has been impacted by a regional war. Case in point today, Israel and Hamas and Gaza, the spillover into Lebanon. But this is how I grew up in this country. In the 1990s, this is very familiar. Except it was over a long period of time, and we grew accustomed to it. There would be Israeli attacks sometimes on a daily basis post-Civil War Lebanon. So that's really the 90s, primarily until Israel withdrew in 2000. But that decade, we saw two things happen, which kind of segues back to today. A smaller group that was primarily in the background of Lebanese politics, emerging into a sub-state proxy, which is Hezbollah, and today dictating two things: state sovereignty and also politics. So we have right now in 2024 is familiarity in regional war, but at least with Lebanon, something a little different, which is Hezbollah's ascendance to politics and de facto control.
Yes, let's turn then to Hezbollah and their origins. Much like Hamas, Hezbollah wouldn't exist without Israel. Can you talk about how Hezbollah came to be and its relationship to the state of Israel?
Sure. So post 1982, Israel's invasion of Beirut and its siege of Beirut, Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat, names that belong to the 90s as well. We don't talk about them today. Arafat is dislodged from Lebanon. Arafat and the PLO, and particularly the Fatah militia, more or less considered Lebanon home from 1970 until 1982. Post 1982, with Arafat's departure to Tunis, the PLO becomes a non-party to Lebanon's civil war. It becomes inactive when it comes to the broader security problems Lebanon went through. That's around the same time the Iranian Revolution happens, and the Iranian regime changes into a de facto, over time, theocracy with a military bend, a military dictatorship with a theocratic facade. And its primary objective in the early 1980s was, I think, and this is my understanding of Hezbollah, is trying to seek leverage in a country like Lebanon back then, today throughout the region, but primarily in Lebanon, to have what would emerge over time as not just a resistance force that was fighting the Israelis successfully. And I think it's important to remember as well that Hezbollah is a feared entity among Israeli scholars, Israeli soldiers. People talk about Hezbollah not with a joking manner. They take this group seriously. But it grew, and it grew into becoming more than a resistance force against Israel's then occupation of what remained of the South Lebanon, into something else. Post-2000, with Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon, minus the demarcation of the blue line, which is the de facto border between Lebanon and Israel, Hezbollah grew. And Hezbollah took, in a way, it inherited two things. It inherited what the PLO had in Lebanon back then in the 1970s and early 80s, which is sub-state autonomy. The Lebanese government does not dictate the terms of what Hezbollah does militarily. It also inherited something else, which we talk about less and less today because it's history. It inherited the Syrian occupation's leverage and security and intelligence. And the Syrian army left in 2005. Of course, since 2005, this is nearly 20 years ago, we've seen Lebanon go from a country free of Syrian and Israeli occupation into remaining a battlefield. And what that battlefield is, I think, depends who you ask. But the de facto situation is that Lebanon is a battlefield right now for this larger Arab-Israeli war. Case in point, what you said earlier, which is true, Lebanese are getting killed. In 2024, this is now 34 years since the civil war's end. Lebanese are still dying through battle. And I think it's also maybe important to remember that despite anniversaries going by over time, we're 49 years since the civil war's start. That's 5 decades. Lebanon should not be in this situation, but unfortunately it is. Hence my point earlier, which is this is very familiar terrain.
Unfortunately so. Can you expand on the nature of the civil war and the role of Palestinian refugees who were expelled from what is now Israel in that particular destabilization?
I'll put it into context as much as I can without boring you or the audience.
That's not possible.
Not possible? Good. As somebody who podcasts for a living, I take that for granted.
Yes.
The refugees of this country pay an unfortunate price for geopolitics that has nothing to do with them. Just yesterday, Syrian refugees are being ambushed in the country, falsely associated with another political assassination that happened several days ago. A member of the Lebanese Forces political party was ambushed and killed. His body was dumped in Syria. There is an association that Syrian refugees are to blame, and this is absolutely false. Yet you have Syrian refugees getting beaten up on the streets. And I don't know if you've been to Beirut before, but in case you haven't been here, this is a buzzing city even during darker times. Right now, the reason there's fair quiet in the city is not because of Ramadan or the Eid holiday that's today. It's that there are Syrian workers not on the streets of Beirut, not on the streets at night out of fear. To throw that back to the civil war and the Palestinian refugee dilemma, Palestinian refugees have been living here since 1948. Since the creation of Israel and the dismantlement of the British Mandate of Palestine, these Palestinian refugees have been living in this country primarily as second-class citizens. That may be actually polite to describe them as such. These are descendants of those refugees from 1948. There are some that arrive in 1967 as well, but the bulk, the bigger numbers from 1948, living in refugee camps. And refugee camps, I think, is also maybe complementary. These are more like ghettos. And there are UN agencies that have limited agency to operate within these camps, but not that much. And only until recently, Palestinian refugees could not work in most employment sectors anyway. You have a struggling population that's deprived of their dignity, living in this country as the Arab-Israeli war drags on. That's something important to be mentioned, perhaps in context. There is a huge Arab-Israeli war that is fought in 1967, the June 1967 war that changes the borders of the Middle East. This is when the Golan Heights of Syria are occupied and later annexed by Israel. This is when the West Bank is taken from Jordan, East Jerusalem as well, annexed. This is when the Gaza Strip is taken into Israel from Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula as well. So Israel multiplies. I don't know what, maybe perhaps a third of its territory expands further. It's a huge geographic gain for that country. Lebanon, not one shot is fired across the border between this country and Israel. And that's because this is the time in Lebanon's history where there was enough, just enough, of a neutral policy that was state promoted, and that Lebanon would be spared from regional wars taking place. That was a de facto state policy in the 1960s. We lost that agency long ago. And Arafat's arrival to this country, the PLO's establishment here in this country, changes those conditions forever. You don't have a Lebanese army in control of the Lebanese state, or at least its security and defense, peace and war. Instead, you have a sub-state militia that is dictating those terms. 5 years later, in 1975,
Well, can I
roughly
can I
5 years.
pause
Oh,
just
sorry,
for
please.
1 second, just to
course.
sit with that for a moment? So this influx of Palestinian refugees expelled in the Nakba, expelled in the decades prior, basically creates destabilization within Lebanon. And I mean, and the now, of course, you say the continued Palestinian refugees are second-class citizens as well. But that, I mean, how many Palestinian refugees came during that time period? And I guess, you know, how did the PLO kind of sap the agency of the Lebanese government and take on so much power within the country?
I appreciate you asking these questions. This is why I come prepared with a pen and paper. Thank you for
Okay,
asking
good.
this. It is roughly 100,000 Palestinian refugees that moved from the Galilee, which is northern Israel, northern Palestine, into Lebanon. So roughly 100,000 settle here. I think it's about the same in Syria as well. And the numbers in Jordan escape me now. But 100,000 refugees that flee war and flee the catastrophe, Nakba, end up in Lebanon 22 years before politics changes in this country. So it's 1948. The refugees that live in camps and are deprived of most rights remain refugees, even though the PLO and Fatah is operating in other countries, and it's not their doing here. These refugees are simply suffering in Lebanon, but politics is changing in the region designed for war. It's 1969. That's the year things changed for Lebanon and when the PLO sets up its base in this country months later. It's called the Cairo Agreement. This is a settlement where Arafat and Fatah are not sustainable to the Jordanian regime. Prior to that, Arafat considered Jordan home. There is a brief civil war in Jordan that spells the end for Arafat's presence in that country. And the Cairo Agreement is an Arab League agreement that more or less suggests a better place for Arafat, which is southern Lebanon, loosely termed back then as Fatah land, meaning that army, that sub-state army, that militia can operate in southern Lebanon to fight Israel. The association with that group, that militia, that infrastructure with refugees, it takes a few years before all hell breaks loose. And that's April 13, 1975. The reason I'm mentioning 1969 and 1975 in the same essence is that it takes a few years for Lebanon to completely break down into outright anarchy. But something happens, which is other militia take hold. There is a reaction, a military-like reaction to Fatah in this country. And suddenly you have names that they're now featured in documentaries, they're mentioned in films altogether, like the Phalange, the Kata'ib militia. These are right-wing Lebanese paramilitary men that decide to arm themselves and fight Fatah in this country too. This is when things spin out of control, and the Lebanese army is really not playing a role. It's in 1975, April 1975, and the marker is a tragic marker. It's a bus attack, where Palestinian refugees are killed, moving from one part of the city to the other. And that's the beginning of the civil war.
And what was Israel and the United States' role in this? I mean, did they interfere? Did they allow this to play out? Did they take sides in this Lebanese civil conflict?
I think the de facto U.S. position vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli struggle, long-term disaster, the century-long tragedy that has ruined politics for the Middle East and made this part of the world ungovernable, is a solid standby, steadfast support for Israel. Back then, there was a Lebanese state that the U.S. had better ties with, and there was a state that they could talk to as well. Not what we have right now, which is almost a shell of a state that panders to geopolitical problems, not to Lebanese interests. But back then, the Lebanese state was a friend to the US for the most part. And actually, it's the American Marines that pay a heavy price in the early 1980s for that steadfast support back then to trying to reconfigure and reconstruct Lebanon during the war. This is a 1980s Marine barracks, and I don't remember the exact numbers, maybe 150, if not more, US soldiers are killed in this country. And the numbers actually could be wrong. It could be much larger than that. But the US Embassy, which used to be in Beirut, is blown up twice. The US Embassy today is not in Beirut. It's in the outskirts of the city. It's almost like a fortress on the hills outside of Beirut. The US policy to Lebanon, this is going back to the Reagan years, this is a long time ago, was that peacekeeping is not going to work. At times, cosmetic strikes, and sorry to use this term this way, cosmetic meaning the USS New Jersey, this was a ship that was parked in the Mediterranean, would sometimes strike in the mountains of Lebanon occasionally. Nothing like Israel's siege into Beirut, nothing like earlier American involvement. There was a distancing. And it wasn't actually, I think it's until the late 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, there was a travel ban on Americans coming to this country. Almost considered a pariah state that was then under Syrian occupation, but disinterest in anything related to this country. What became, and I think remains, a primary concern is Israel's security for America. And that has had deep disadvantages, especially to those trying to not get sucked into, which I think is false binaries, which is you're either supporting Israel or you're not supporting Israel.
Or you're with
either
Iran.
pro-Israel. Exactly. I think Lebanon's interests, which in my opinion, my assessment, are best reflected in the 1960s, where this country doesn't have to pay a price for a huge outreach taking shape in the region. I think that model, that aspiration, I don't see that today as a priority for any US administration, both Republican or Democrat.
Certainly. Although the politics around Israel, I will say, are rapidly changing in this country in a way that I couldn't foresee. But you know, I think that the context of, you know, the settler colonial project of Israel basically creating this incredible destabilization is so key. One, due to the fact that we often hear, why won't the other Arab countries just take these people? I mean, why won't they just take them? There must be something inherently wrong with them. When you see, though, that actually Arab countries, whether it be Jordan, whether it be Syria, whether it be Lebanon, countries in the region did take on many Palestinian refugees after the Nakba. But the continued expansionist aims by Israel have contributed to even more deep stabilization for now 75 years.
You know, it's quite interesting. I think all of these different facts are all accurate, and they shape, I think, how regimes interact with each other in this part of the world. And I'll give you an example. Roughly 10 years ago, the Syrian regime was bombing Palestinian refugee camps in Syria. You have thousands of Palestinian refugees killed by the Assad regime. You have today thousands of Palestinian refugees. What's the number now? 35,000, perhaps more. Palestinian refugees and civilians in Gaza getting killed on a daily basis. I think both are true in that these regimes and Israel's nominal enemies as well, I think, have hijacked this cause and turned it into one that perverts society. It destroys politics, but it also destroys society, especially where divisions are fragile. Case in point is a country like Lebanon, where you have a Palestinian cause, a moral support that is real, and I think that's majority, and that Lebanese look at the suffering of what's happening right now in Gaza and open their hearts and extend their sympathies always. That's the overwhelming majority sentiment. Despite calls to the contrary, I think that is true. What is also true is that this cause can be hijacked. You can have a paramilitary force like Hezbollah, which its raison d'etre is to fight Israel, built to defend Iran's interests, but its raison d'etre is to fight Israel. It has taken a very calculated, very cautious, very defensive approach into supporting Hamas and fighting Israel. And right now, Hezbollah's initiation on the Lebanese side on October 8 is described mostly as one of caution. So I think all of this can be true, and that this cause, first and foremost, has destroyed not just Palestine, but the chances for the Palestinian people to have a normal life. I don't think this is going to happen in our lifetime as well. Speaking about the earlier generation, our generation as well, unfortunately, it seems like this is impossible given the current circumstances. But the ripple effects of that cause and the trajectory of that cause into what looks like politics but is not, it's mostly security and regime survivability, that also destroys not just Palestine, it destroys the neighborhood too, which is why I think over time, the patience for this cause, and especially in a country that is vulnerable to regional war, I think the patience is thinning by the day. And Lebanon today, right now, does not resemble the Lebanon of the 1960s one bit. This is a country that looks increasingly on the brink of civil war once more. That's an unfortunate ripple effect to a regional war being fought outside of its natural borders.